Welcome, friends, to At Home with Theosophy. This is the second class in this series. We are exploring the development of the thought power using Annie Besant's book, Thought Power, and we are exploring the last 4 chapters. This is a second series. In the first one, we looked into the first part of the book. The two are more or less independent from each other. This series is basically about meditation and how to use the power of thought to help others, as we will see in the last talk. So today, we have seen the idea of concentration as one of the main tools to sharpen the power of our thoughts. So Annie Besant is going to explore some of the obstacles for concentration, how we can deal with them, what kind of practice will help us improve concentration, and some concepts about meditation itself. So let us start with the obstacles to concentration. She says, the universal complaint which comes from those who are beginning to practice concentration is that the very attempt to concentrate results in a greater restlessness of the mind. To some extent, this is true, for the law of action and reaction works here as everywhere, and the pressure put on the mind causes a corresponding reaction. Remember, we mentioned this in our previous class. There is especially in the material aspect of the universe, what we could call an inertia, a tendency to preserve the state in which any object or entity is. If not for this attempt at preserving the present state, forms and structures would easily fall apart. So our minds, in the Theosophical view, are living principles, and they do have also this kind of self-preservation mechanism. So the mind has been accustomed to be, let's say, unfettered, and when we try to start controlling it, there is a reaction in the mind principle to resist that kind of control that we are trying to exert by means of concentration. So that is part of the experience that many people report when they try to concentrate, that they say, my mind gets even more restless than usual when I try to focus it. And Annie Besant says part of the experience is due to this. However, there is also another very important aspect that she says, but while admitting this, we find on closer study that this experience of increased restlessness is largely illusory. The feeling of such increased restlessness is chiefly due to the opposition suddenly set up between the ego, this is a technical term in Theosophy to refer to the soul, who is willing steadiness, and the mind, which is in its normal condition of mobility. So long as we yield to every movement of the mind, we do not realize its continual activity and restlessness. So she says the bulk of this experience that the mind becomes more restless comes because when we try to practice concentration, now we begin to oppose that tendency of the mind to be restless, and it is only then that we notice the strong tendency to restlessness. It is like being in a big river, and we just float along with the current, and we may not realize, if we don't look at the shore, we may not realize how fast the current is going, how strong it is. But if we try to start swimming upstream, only then we start realizing the strength of that current. So similarly, as long as we think we are the mind, we think whatever the mind wants to do is what I want to do or what we want to do, then there is no contradiction there. There is no contrast. The moment we start trying to stop to direct the activity of the mind is when we realize how restless it is. For this reason, Annie Besant said, this brings about an important realization, the realization that I am not the mind, or at least I'm not entirely the mind, because the mind has its own movement, it has its own tendencies, it goes in certain trains of thought, even if I don't want to go there, the mind drags me there. So obviously there is some kind of difference between the mind and myself. When we are actively thinking, we think, I am the mind, the one that is talking right now. It seems like, I am this mind thinking. But with the process of meditation, we start discovering that we are an awareness that is behind. That awareness may influence the mind to do certain things, but many times the mind will have its own tendencies that go against, let's say, the wishes of that awareness. And that's in that contrast is when we start realizing we are different from the mind. Now, Besant says that this universal experience of how difficult it is to steady the mind was voiced by Arjuna 5,000 years ago. And she's referring to the Bhagavad Gita, which is a Hindu scripture that, tradition says was produced about 3,000 years BC, when Krishna was alive. This is a dialogue between Arjuna and Krishna. Krishna is an embodiment of the deity, a similar concept to the one that is in Christianity with Jesus as an embodiment of God. So there is a conversation between Arjuna, who is the disciple, and Krishna, who is the teacher. And Krishna is telling Arjuna that he has to work on controlling the mind, or having self-mastery over the mind. And Arjuna says, this yoga, which thou hast declared to be by equanimity, by keeping a calm attitude, I see no stable foundation for it, because, or for the mind is verily restless. It is impetuous, strong, and difficult to bend. I deem it as hard to curb as the wind. So this is, written in the Bhagavad Gita 5,000 years ago, and the same experience can be had right now by people in a completely different culture, different time. So obviously this is a universal feature of the mind, not something just that the person who is trying to start meditating finds it difficult because somehow that person is not good at meditating. This is a universal experience of how difficult it is to hold the mind. And Besant says, and still is true the answer by Krishna, pointing out the only way to success. So Krishna says, without doubt, the mind is hard to curb and restless, but it may be curbed by constant practice and by indifference. The Sanskrit words for these are abhyasa. Abhyasa means practice, constant practice. And indifference is a translation of the Sanskrit vairagya, which can be translated as indifference in the sense of non-desire. Also, sometimes is used, the word detachment is used, although detachment in the West, sometimes it has, especially in the psychological field, it has a different connotation, maybe non-attachment. In Theosophical literature, this word is sometimes called or translated as desirelessness. By indifference, it doesn't mean that one is, apathetic. The idea here is that one is not affected, is not different, his or her attitude, depending on the results of the action or whether something is, pleasant or unpleasant, etc. So basically, Krishna is saying here, by constant practice and by reducing our desires and attachments, etc., the mind can be mastered. And this is very important. Patanjali, one of the fathers, let's say, of yoga, especially the yoga of meditation, prescribes exactly the same as Krishna. He says that the mind can be brought to quiet, calm, let's say, by means of these two things, constant practice and desirelessness. And this is a problem we have in the West, because on one side, in our daily life, we are constantly creating new desires, new ambitions, new thirst for or more thirst for more sensations. And that is opposite to what we need in order to learn how to keep the mind quiet. If we are constantly stimulating the mind, then we cannot expect it that all of a sudden, when we sit to meditate, the mind will be calm. This is not like flipping, the light is on or off. So if we are serious about meditation, we have to little by little work in our lives so that we begin to live in a more simple way, without being constantly stimulating our mind, our desires, our sensations. That doesn't mean to lead an ascetic life, a life of renunciation, but we can work on seeking more a state of inner poise and harmony and peace, rather than a constant state of excitement and pleasure and seeking for new things. So these two qualities, a constant practice, and Annie Besant will talk about that. That's why I won't explain much about this. And a work on trying to stimulate less our minds. These two things are necessary if we really want to use meditation as a tool to discover our true nature and to awaken the latent powers that are in our minds. So one of the practices that Annie Besant proposes is thought selection. She says the mind is like a magnet, attracting and repelling, and the nature of its attractions and repulsions can be determined by ourselves. If we watch the thoughts which come into our minds, we shall find that they are of the same kind as those which we habitually encourage. So when we sit to meditate, the thoughts that will come to our minds are the thoughts that we are nurturing during the day. Here again, there are some thoughts that are more in tune with the meditative state, and there are other thoughts that definitely are in disharmony with the meditative state. So if most of our thoughts are about fears or anxieties or jealousy or ambitions, etc., when we sit to meditate, those thoughts will come to the surface of our minds. If little by little we reduce those thoughts and we encourage what most spiritual traditions would call virtuous thoughts, then we will see that those thoughts are not really opposed to the kind of atmosphere that has to be created in meditation. And even though we need eventually to leave those thoughts behind too, at least those thoughts help to create the proper atmosphere. So Annie Besant says the kind of thoughts that will come are directly related to the kind of thoughts that we stimulate during the day. We all live in a continual current of thoughts, good and evil. People who are training their minds should maintain an attitude of steady watchfulness and exercise a constant selection with regard to the thoughts that come into the mind. So these are two aspects or two features of the practice that she recommends. One, steady watchfulness. Maybe today we could use the word mindfulness or awareness or witnessing, self-observation. There has to be a certain level of awareness about what our minds are doing. And this is a practice that unless we really try to work on this, it's not something that our education and our culture teaches how to do. We are taught how to pay attention to the external world so that we can manipulate it and extract from the external world what we desire. But we are very rarely taught to pay attention to the inner world, to the world of our thoughts and emotions. So this is a practice that we have to start working on, to be aware of our thoughts and emotions. This practice of self-observation or recollection, sometimes it is called in Christian mysticism, or self-remembering, although that's to me maybe a little confusing. More than remembering ourselves, we have to keep an eye on what our minds and emotions do. So that is one aspect. And as we develop the ability to be aware of what is coming into the mind, as she says, we need to develop another skill that is the one that lets go of the negative thoughts and focuses on the positive thoughts. So this kind of selection has nothing to do with what psychology may call repression. Psychology is sometimes, as useful as it may be in several aspects, it doesn't, from an occult point of view, it doesn't have enough nuance in understanding the mental processes, because repression happens when a person is not able to face certain thoughts out of fear, out of shame, out of simply not wanting to suffer, dealing with those thoughts. And sometimes, of course, we need to deal with certain thoughts because they are related to a situation in daily life and we have to deal with them. When we don't want to do that because we don't want to face them or to suffer, etc., all those kind of attitudes produce some kind of repression, because it's basically the giving up of our awareness to dealing with what is there. Now, the kind of selection that Annie Besant recommends is a completely different process, because this selection is first the recognition of a negative trend of thought. There is an awareness of that. And then there is an assertion of our free will to engage with the thoughts or not. So if we see that there are negative thoughts that are going to end up in just creating, negative emotions, thinking ill about other people, etc., we have the freedom to say, it's useless to go on this road. I know where it ends. It's not going to solve anything. And I refuse to engage in this. So I'm not going to feed these kind of thoughts. I'm going to instead place my attention on something positive. We need to develop a certain wisdom to know when we need to deal with certain thoughts and when we need not to engage with them. Repetitive thoughts, many times that means there is something that my consciousness, my awareness cannot solve. So I have to pay attention to them, see what is really happening, be aware of them, questioning, inquiring into the cause of this. But many times there are negative thoughts that are coming really from outside. Many times they are not our thoughts. There is just the general human tendency to be critical, to engage in, I don't know, gossip, etc. And many other times there are thoughts that are just the product of the situation. They are superficial, and we can simply say, I'm not going to engage there, and that's it. So with practice, we begin to recognize when we need to work with certain thought patterns and when those thoughts are just temporary, and we learn how not to engage with the negative thoughts. So developing this self-awareness, this self-observation, and learning not to engage in negative thoughts are very important practices to begin to transform our minds and the activities of our minds. And that will be the foundation of a mind that can be concentrated, a mind that can be used by the soul, by our pure awareness, as an instrument instead of the other way around, the soul being a victim of what of the mind's reactions and tendencies, let's say. So she continues, the refusal to harbor evil thoughts, their prompt ejection if they effect an entry, the immediate replacement of an evil thought by a good one of opposite character. This practice will so tune the mind that after a time it will act automatically, repelling the evil on its own accord. So this technique of changing a bad thought for a good one was also recommended by Patanjali in the Yoga Sutras, that is this book, foundational book on yoga that he wrote or compiled from the traditional teachings that were there. And the idea is to replace negative thoughts for positive thoughts of the opposing character. So if you will have a thought, that is of fear, to replace it by a thought of courage, of confidence. Or if you have a thought of, I don't know, you may desire something that you don't have, then you replace it by a thought of contentment and gratitude or things like that. In doing so, you don't only not engage with negative thoughts, but you are making the mind vibrate at a rate that is in tune with positive thoughts. And as we explained in the previous series, every time our minds are vibrating with certain thoughts, let's say, we attract from the mental plane, mental matter, mental energy, let's say, that is in tune with that rate of vibration. So if I have negative thoughts, they vibrate at a certain rate, which attracts more mental matter that is in tune with that vibration. And therefore, it becomes easier for me to engage in negative thoughts. If, on the contrary, I stimulate positive thoughts, by positive, I don't mean thoughts like I can have everything I want, I have the power to fulfill all my desires. From an esoteric point of view, those thoughts are not necessarily positive. They are self-centered thoughts, and they can produce bad karma. By positive, I mean thoughts that are in tune with our spiritual nature, with spiritual truths of unity and compassion and love, etc. So if we encourage these positive thoughts, then we attract mental matter that will make it easier for our minds to harbor those kinds of positive thoughts, and less easy to host negative thoughts. So this technique of replacing one thought for the other in this way is quite effective. Sometimes you will see it is very difficult to do it. It's, you will experience this more frequently when the thought is taken by a strong emotion. It's difficult to just switch from a strong negative emotion to something that is positive. So sometimes the next best option is simply not to engage in the negative thoughts, but to turn your attention to something else consciously, not escaping from these negative thoughts, but as a conscious decision, as an assertion of your free will to say, I'm not going to engage this, and you focus on something else, gardening, whatever something else is, uh, obviously not something negative, so that at least you don't engage in the negative thoughts. So you see in your life when one or the other technique are possible. As you become more skillful with these techniques, then you will see that it becomes easier to switch the thoughts, a negative for a positive. You will also find out that the secret of being able to do this lies in catching the train of thought right at the beginning, before it builds up. Because when it builds up, it acquires a kind of inertia again that is difficult to oppose later on. So as you try this, you will begin to realize a negative thought, once it is too strong to do anything about it. Then little by little, you start realizing it when the thought is developing, and yet you won't be able to stop it. But then with practice, you will begin to realize when the thought is beginning to gain strength, and that's the time when you can act and select a different thought. In time, as Annie Besant says here, this becomes kind of automatic. So a negative thought comes, you notice it, and you drop it. In normal circumstances, of course, in life there can always be circumstances, that will be more difficult, more shocking, or something, and you won't be able to do this. But if you observe your mind throughout the day, we engage in negative thoughts that are useless, that we could do something different. Only, in certain more critical situations, we may not have the strength to select the thoughts, but in most cases throughout the day we can. And that's where we should start our practice, not with the most difficult and critical moments, but our daily thinking in just dealing with life. Now, Annie Besant here gives also a very important psychological insight coming from, the occult teachings. She says, but it may be well to add that when an evil thought enters the mind, it is better not to fight with it directly. In fighting against anything, the very force we send out causes a corresponding reaction and thus increases our trouble. Remember what we said at the beginning, that the mind tends to react to our attempt at trying to control it. Similarly, when there are negative thoughts that come into our minds, if we get worried about them, why am I thinking this? If we have the feeling, I'm failing, man, or I'm a sinner, or I'm not a good person, if we get like, involved with the negative thought, and we react to it, and we just try to fight it, that is not really very effective. First, it's not based on a truth. Thoughts come to our minds from the external world, and also from our own past. And what has been created in the past, it has been created. It will be there. The now is the moment to act. So what we do now is what matters. So it's not the idea that, we should be worried about negative thoughts. That is not a right attitude. This is something that I created in the past. Who am I right now? How am I to deal with this? This is not me anymore. Engaging with them means that I'm still this, but the very fact that they appear to my awareness, that doesn't mean this is what I am. This is what I have built from the past. But most importantly, this kind of action with our negative thoughts is not effective. So what Annie Besant is saying here, when there are negative thoughts, when there are thoughts of worry, thoughts of fear, thoughts of loneliness, thoughts of, any of these things, don't fight them, just focus on the opposite thoughts. Of course, there are many things that you can do. Again, you can challenge the thoughts in the sense of saying, is this true? Is this thought, is there really a basis for this kind of thinking? Can I look at life from a different perspective? This is all part of the aim of meditation. If there are recurring feelings of anything, loneliness, or of being left out, or of life not giving us what we want, in meditation, we should examine those thoughts, the assumptions that are behind the thoughts. We should try to use what we learn from the Theosophical literature about the nature of reality, of the nature of us as a soul, etc. And we should try to reframe how would I interpret life from this point of view, from the point of view of the spiritual truths that I'm learning. All that are things that we can do in meditation. But when these thoughts come, instead of worrying about them, just focus on the positive thoughts. And basically what you are doing is starving the negative tendencies in your mind, because you are not giving them energy. There is a little saying that says, if you are in the darkness, don't worry, don't fight the darkness, just light a candle, because the light will take care of the darkness. So the meaning is this: don't worry about these negative thoughts, just bring more light into your awareness, and that will take care of the negative thoughts. Little by little, those thoughts will be weakened and eventually will be, rejected from your system, so to say. So this is what Annie Besant says. She continues, utilize the fact that the mind can only think of one thing at a time. Turn the mind at once to a good thought, and the evil one will be expelled. So this is a very interesting and comforting, I think, technique. Stop worrying about the negative, focus on the positive, and let the positive take care of the negative. And again, by positive, I mean, spiritually positive. And then Annie Besant mentions what I explained before. Further, as the mind draws matter which does not respond to the evil, it is gradually becoming unreceptive to that kind of negative thought. So there is this kind of transformation of our mental body by which negative thoughts find less and less space to develop in our mental body, and the positive, the spiritual thoughts begin to find more and more space to develop. So eventually there is this purification that simply doesn't give oxygen, so to say, to negative thoughts. And she gives us this piece of advice. It is a good plan constantly to furnish the mind with some high thought, some word of cheer, some inspiration to noble living. Ere we go forth into life's turmoil day by day, we should give the mind this shield of good thought. A few words are enough, taken from some scripture, and this, fixed in the mind by a few recitations in the early morning, will recur to the mind again and again during the day, and will be found repeating itself in the mind whenever the mind is disengaged. So this is, I would say, the original use of affirmations. Unfortunately, today, affirmations are many times used in a quite materialistic way to attain our wishes, our desires, etc. But the way Theosophical literature, which was one of the first movements to talk about these affirmations, there was also the what later was called the New Thought movement, that was more or less at the same time. They came from the what was called Christian Science. They also started using affirmations. At the beginning, it was a lot around health and the idea that a healthy body came from a virtuous mind. So many times the affirmations had to do with similar things that Theosophy was recommended. But little by little in that line, some of the authors began to use the affirmations for more material attainments, first of health, and then by extension of different things that we desire. And today you have like The Secret, that book where you can use the power of thought to precipitate $1 million. All of that, first from the theosophical point of view, happiness, peace, compassion, contentment does not come by acquiring material things. Simply look at the people who have those things and see if they are compassionate, peaceful, content people. For the most part, they are not. But also, in the theosophical view, you are misusing a power because you are using it for selfish reasons. So the theosophical idea is take affirmations about the reality of the world, the reality of yourself, who you really are as a soul, as an eternal, being or self, as the source of courage, the source of love, the source of wisdom, etc. Unity. So that's why Annie Besant says, take some scripture, some serious spiritual tradition, and use some of those phrases to meditate on in the morning, and then throughout the day, when your mind is not engaged in anything, bring it back. So maybe you have this affirmation about you being eternal, you obviously not as a body, but you, the true you, and then you can meditate on that in the morning and to keep it in mind throughout the day. And the awareness of eternity, little by little, becomes more and more of an intuition in the sense of a feeling of certainty. And that will be the source of courage. Many times, being afraid to be hurt, damaged, killed, either psychologically or physically, these are sources of reactions. So an affirmation about your eternal nature could be, or any other that is a spiritual affirmation, and that's a very good practice to do. Now, coming to the actual practice of concentration, remember in the previous class we said it involves fixing your attention on some particular object of concentration or meditation. As we will see, meditation is something that happens naturally as the mind gets focused. But there are some dangers that you have to be aware of so that you can prevent them. Annie Besant mentions a couple, there are more. But she says, when concentration is commenced, the body follows the mind. The muscles become rigid and the nerves tense. Hence, great physical fatigue, muscular and nervous exhaustion, acute headache are very apt to follow in the wake of concentration. And thus people are led to give it up, believing that these ill effects are inevitable. You see, our mind and our bodies have evolved together for so long that there tends to be a connection between them. You see, for example, when the kids are trying to learn how to write, that they make all kind of faces, and they, you notice that they are making a physical effort in trying to be able to write. Or when we are doing different physical activities that are hard, that we are trying to learn how to do, again, all that effort is translated in our face, for example, which it's not necessary, if you are doing a physical effort with your body. So when we sit to concentrate, it is very common that in the mental effort of fixing the mind, our body becomes tense, our nerves become tense, and that produces physical effects. If your meditation is relaxing and letting anything come to your mind, that may be nice and relaxing. That's not the kind of concentration that Annie Besant is talking about here. If you are really practicing fixing the mind somewhere, then you will see that there is an effort involved there, and that effort tends to be transferred to the body. So Annie Besant will say, if you start noticing any pain, then you should stop the practice for the day, or maybe you can take it later on. But for the moment, you should not push the body into the region of pain, because pain is a signal that there is something that is some structure that is being destroyed. Basically, the matter, as I keep saying, has its own inertia, and if we force it too suddenly, we may produce some kind of, hurt. It may be slight, we may not even notice it much, or it may be more significant. It depends on many factors. So basically, you have to keep an eye on your body, especially your mind, your brain, your head, because a lot of this activity will concentrate on the head, or if you do other kinds of meditations on the heart, etc. So it's important to keep an eye on this so that you don't transfer the tension in the mental effort into physical effort. And she says, as a matter of fact, these problems can be avoided by a simple precaution. The beginner should now and again, break off his concentration sufficiently to notice the state of his body. And if he finds it strained, tense, or rigid, he should at once relax. So you are concentrating, and keep an eye on the body every now and then. You may notice that, I don't know, your shoulders are tense, or your face is tense, or your hands are clasped. So keeping an eye on the body will let you see when the body is reacting in this way, and then you let go, you relax, and then go back to your concentration. And you may have to do this for some time, for a next amount of sitting, practices. Eventually, the body learns not to follow the effort of the mind in that way. Annie Besant says, when this has been done several times, the links of association will be broken, and the body will remain pliant and resting while the mind is concentrated. Another physical danger arises from the effect produced by concentration on the nerve cells of the brain. As the power of concentration increases and the mind is stilled, the ego, the soul, begins to work through the mind, and it makes a new demand on the brain nerve cells. Connecting more to the higher consciousness is not something that is without its dangers, let's say. This is why in the Theosophical tradition, the discipline that is recommended is a very holistic discipline, because physical matter has its own rate of vibration. And that rate of vibration is harmonized with what we call in Theosophy the lower mind, the regular mind, the mind that is, is interested in material objects, in the personal emotions and thoughts, etc. They are all more or less harmonized. Now, when we start bringing in other states of consciousness, higher states of consciousness, they begin to put a certain strain in the matter of our bodies. From an occult point of view, the matter has its own aura, and that aura has its own rate of vibration. So when the higher consciousness begins to have more place in our brain and body, it begins to shake, let's say, a little more the matter of our body. And like what happens on the physical plane, when there is friction, there is some kind of heat, there is some kind of resistance that happens there. So in the Theosophical tradition, it is recommended that along with the spiritual practice, our diet also has to gradually change to follow that growth in our consciousness. So the food that we eat should be food that is more spiritual, let's say. For example, in Hinduism, they talk about food having different qualities. The quality of inertia and stability, and something that makes it difficult to change of state, or food that has the quality of restlessness, of constant change, or food that has the quality of balance. There are Sanskrit words associated to this: tamas, rajas, sattva, for those who know about this. So the idea is to start having a diet that incorporates more and more of the spiritual food, the food that produces a certain kind of vibration that is more in tune with the spirituality. Again, it's not that if you start meditating, all of a sudden, this will generate a huge problem in your body. In general, that doesn't happen, although with some people it may happen. There are many karmic reasons, or if the organism is not very stable and is very sensitive, it may happen. But as part of the practice, it's important what we do physically. So if you are serious in this, you should little by little start changing your diet so that it accompanies the spiritual effort you are doing. So Annie Besant continues that if in the process of concentration there is a feeling of dullness in your head or heaviness all over the brain, this is a danger signal. If this be disregarded, acute pain will follow and obstinate inflammation may ensue. So you will see that when you are pushing too much, you will start feeling like, first like a dullness that she says. You feel that your mind is not all that clear, and then you will feel like a certain pressure. She says a heaviness or a pressure. All this very subtle, but in concentration you can notice it. If you keep going, then you will start developing a headache, for example. So Annie Besant says, if these sensations appear, then you have to relax the effort. Many people may not experience this, especially perhaps at the beginning, because unless they have developed a certain amount of willpower, and most people, most beginners, let's say, will not have enough willpower at the beginning to push the brain to that situation. Although many may have, because we don't know how much we have practiced these things in previous lifetimes. But as you become more skilled, you will see that it becomes more and more possible for your will to keep pushing beyond the limits of what the body can take. So on those occasions, or at that point, it's especially important that you respect the limitations that the body is setting. Because if, out of overzealousness or spiritual ambition or, over eagerness, you keep pushing, that is not good for the organism. So Annie Besant says, concentration, the true effort of concentrating the mind should therefore be practiced very sparingly at first, and should never be carried to the point of brain fatigue. A few minutes at a time is enough for a beginning, the time being lengthened gradually as the practice goes on. In other writings, she says, 5 minutes of a genuine effort to focus your mind will be probably all you can do when you start, working on this. Of course, again, if your meditation is sitting and relaxing, you can do it for longer. But if you are going to use this practice to um, to generate this thought power, which involves the ability to focus your mind, the ability to visualize properly, the ability to to have a sense of mastery over the thoughts, then this is work. And you will see that in your effort to focus your mind without moving from the object of concentration, 5 minutes every day will be more than enough at the beginning, and for a while you will see that little by little you may be able to do it for a longer time. Time doesn't really matter here. What matters is that you do the exercise regularly, even if it is 2 minutes. Start with 2 minutes, 2 minutes of earnest, trying to keep your mind focused will be more than enough. So Annie Besant says, however short the time which is given to it, it should be given regularly. If a day's practice be missed, the previous condition reasserts itself and the work has to be recommenced. Steady and regular, but not prolonged practice ensures the best results and avoids dangers. So again, she would always say, give it 5 minutes every day. That's much better than half an hour today, then 2 days of not doing it, 15 minutes tomorrow. It's just like a diet, you may starve yourself one day, and then the next 2 days you eat as you were eating before, and then you starve yourself the next day, and no real change happens. It's better than, instead of starving yourself, you gradually reduce, the amount, for example, and then that will give a better result. So similar with this, it's better a constant practice, shorter, something that is manageable, than this more spasmodic kind of practice. Now, another danger, she says, in some schools, students are recommended to assist concentration by fixing the eyes on a black spot on a white wall, or there are other variations, or fixing your sight on a flame, or fixing your sight on some physical object, and to maintain this fixity of gaze until trance supervenes. Now, there are two reasons why this should not be done. First, the practice, after a while, injures the physical sight, and the eyes lose their power of adjustment. So fixing your eyes on a spot on a wall, for example, is basically what happens with our eyes. When we are for too long on the computer or reading a book or something, that fixity of the physical eyes begin to make them lose the flexibility. That's why doctors recommend to, every now and then, to change the focus of your eyes and look far in the horizon. And so it's not good for the eyes. If you add a brilliant light, a bright light, like in a candle, or some others even say the sun, then you are beginning to also damage the cones of the cells of the eyes. So that is not recommended. That's one of the reasons. The second reason, she says, it brings about a form of brain paralysis. This begins with the fatigue of the retinal cells as the waves of light beat on them and the spot disappears from view. The place on the retina where its image is formed becoming insensitive, the result of prolonged response. So when you fix your eyes, and if you don't move them, Then little by little, the retina becomes insensitive. There is like an overstimulation and becomes non-responsive. And then, as she will explain, she says this fatigue spreads inwards through the optic nerve until finally a kind of paralysis supervenes in the brain and the person passes into a hypnotic trance. So this is the foundation of hypnosis. There is a certain paralysis that happens in the brain by a constant stimulation of the eye. The eyes are directly connected to the brain. The eyes can be seen as an externalization of the brain. So it's relatively easy to produce brain paralysis by a constant stimuli on your eyes. And then you fall into a hypnotic trance. Now, some traditions value this. They suppose that because they know that, true samadhis, true states of ecstasies, make the mind to be completely quiet. They found this trick. In this way, you can make the mind quiet, and they suppose that that's what you are trying to do. Now, from the theosophical point of view, here there is a mistake of cause and effect. The mind or the brain can be made quiet through many tricks, but making the brain quiet is not going to make our awareness be raised to a higher plane. If you raise your awareness to a higher plane, the brain will be quiet, but the opposite is not necessarily true. So Annie Besant says, brain paralysis not only stops all thinking on the physical plane, but renders the brain insensitive to non-physical vibrations, to the higher consciousness, so that the soul cannot impress the brain. It does not set the soul free, but merely deprives it of its instrument. I'm reading this more in the modern language. A person may remain for weeks in a trance thus induced, but when he awakens, he is no wiser than at the beginning of the trance. He has not gained any knowledge, he has merely wasted time. Such methods do not gain spiritual power, but merely bring about physical disability. So in the theosophical approach, these methods are not the way that you develop wisdom, compassion, love. It's easier to generate this kind of trances by these means, but they are not effective. What we are trying to do is to learn to raise our consciousness without externally altering our brain by means of drugs or by means of physical motions or by means of aggressive breathing or by means of fixing the eyes on a stimulus. All these things are tricks to paralyze the brain, but they are not effective spiritually, according to the theosophical tradition. And we end with some words on meditation. Besant says, meditation may be said to have been already explained, for it is only the sustained attitude of the concentrated mind. So the difference between concentration and meditation, these are like sequential states. Concentration is basically when you are still struggling to fix your mind on the object. Once your mind is focused on the object and you are not making any effort any longer, it can be said that you are in the stage of meditation. Now you can work on whatever the meditation technique is without using some of your effort in keeping the mind on track. You have done that. Now the mind is free to engage in whatever technique of meditation you are using. Now, obviously, if this is the case, meditation cannot be effectively performed until concentration is at least partially mastered. For the latter is not an end, but a means to an end. So concentration is not the aim of the spiritual discipline, but it is necessary if you are going to use a technique of meditation effectively, Obviously, your mind has to have acquired the ability to stay steady on that technique of meditation. What most people do is that without having the ability to focus their minds, they may practice different techniques, and the mind is coming and going, coming and going. And that technique of meditation cannot produce the results that is meant to produce because the mind is really not completely focused there. So it is good to spend time, even a few years, in training the mind to focus, and then that mind can use the techniques of meditation effectively. When a concentrated mind is steadily directed to an object, any object, with the view of piercing the veil and reaching the life and drawing that life into union with the life to which the mind belongs, then meditation is performed. So you see here the basic, in the theosophical view, the basis for a meditation to be spiritual is that whatever technique of meditation you are using, you are trying to go beyond the technique, beyond the words or the visualization or the process of inquiry or whatever techniques you use. You are trying to touch the life that is behind, the truth that is behind, the essence of your object of meditation, so that there is a union between your consciousness and the object of meditation, which in all these techniques, in the theosophical meditations, the object of meditation is always something of a spiritual nature. So basically, you use the technique to produce this fusion between your mind and the object of meditation. So she says concentration might be regarded as the shaping of an organ, of the meditative organ. While you practice concentration, you are creating a new organ, in your mental body, let's say, and meditation is using that organ. Anyone who determines to lead a spiritual life must daily devote some time to meditation. As soon may the physical life be sustained without food as the spiritual without meditation. Those who cannot spare half an hour a day during which the world may be shut out and the mind may receive from the spiritual planes a current of life cannot lead the spiritual life. Again, this is the aim. The idea is that as you get more and more serious about this kind of life, then meditation begins to be more and more necessary. Not only meditation, but also how you lead your daily life. Some people may be great at meditating, for a few hours a day, but if during their daily life they are constantly engaging in desires and in personal, reactions, etc., that and will undo what they do in meditation. So it's not only meditation that you need. But as Annie Besant says here, as we grow in the spiritual life, meditation becomes more and more important and a moment when the higher consciousness can begin to impress itself on your physical consciousness. Only to the mind concentrated, steady, shut out from the world, can the divine reveal itself. In that silence, peace and strength and force flow into the soul, and the person of meditation is ever the most efficient person of the world. The concentrated intelligence, the power of withdrawing outside the turmoil, means immensely increased energy in work. It means steadiness, self-control, serenity. The person of meditation is a person who wastes no time, scatters no energy, misses no opportunity. Such a person governs the events, because within him is the power whereof events are only the outer expression. He shares the divine life and therefore shares the divine power. So basically, she at the time when she was writing this, meditation was not really well known. Most people would used to think that meditation was actually becoming less efficient in the world, that you were retreating from the world. So basically, she's saying, because meditation sharpens your mind, your focus, brings the higher consciousness into touch with the physical body, it's not that you become less, you become more by meditation. Today, most of our culture appreciates meditation, so even though this is interesting, I don't think it's so necessary to have a selling pitch for meditation.